June 22nd, 1941. The Eastern Front. Columns of German armor rolled across the dusty roads of Soviet territory. The sun beat down on steel as the pride of the Wehrmacht. Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs advanced with ruthless precision. For months, German crews had trained for this moment. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be the final act in Hitler's vision, a lightning war that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees in just weeks. Inside the cramped steel belly of a Panzer III, a young tank gunner steadied his eye against the sight. Sweat dripped from his brow, not from fear, but from confidence, from expectation. They had crushed France in 6 weeks. Surely the backward Red Army would collapse just as easily. Then, a shape emerged from the tree line. At first glance, it looked like another Soviet machine, perhaps an outdated BT series tank, the kind Germans had already learned to destroy with ease. But as the unknown silhouette drew closer, the crew realized something was different. The armor was sloped, the turret low and menacing, its tracks wide and ready to chew through the marshy soil. The gunner fired. The shell streaked across the battlefield and slammed into the Soviet tank with a deafening clang. But instead of tearing through armor, it ricocheted harmlessly, bouncing into the sky like a pebble against stone. Inside the Panzer, disbelief turned to dread. Another shot, another bounce. The German commander barked orders, his voice cracking as he realized their weapon, their trusted 37mm gun, was useless. Then the Soviet tank's turret turned, slowly, deliberately. Like a predator fixing its gaze on prey, the first Soviet round struck. The Panzer rocked violently, flames erupting inside. The crew scrambled, choking on smoke, their invincibility shattered in an instant. That day, the Germans learned a truth that would echo through the war. They were no longer the hunters. Something new had entered the battlefield, a machine that made their vaunted armor look obsolete overnight. This was the T-34. It had arrived like a ghost, without warning, as if conjured from the soil itself. No German intelligence report had prepared them for this. No strategist had predicted it. And yet here it was, faster, stronger, and more resilient than anything they could field. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, countless German tank crews whispered the same question, again and again. How could the Soviets, and of all people, build a tank like this? The answer would change not just the course of the Eastern Front, but the psychology of war itself. Because in that moment, on dusty, Soviet fields where shells bounced like pebbles, the myth of German invincibility cracked, and the nightmare had only just begun. The world had seen nothing like it. In September 1939, the German war machine unleashed a new kind of warfare upon Poland. It wasn't just about brute force, and it was choreography. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved with deadly precision, striking with speed so overwhelming that defenders barely had time to respond. The German word for it became legendary, blitzkrieg. Lightning war panzer columns cut through Polish defenses like a hot knife through butter. Within weeks, Warsaw fell, and the world looked on in shock. Many thought it was a fluke, until the spring of 1940, when the same storm swept into Western Europe. France had been the fortress of Europe. Its army, one of the largest on the continent, stood behind the impregnable Maginot Line. Britain stood ready to support. Yet in just 6 weeks, German armor accomplished the unthinkable. Paris fell. The mighty French army, broken. The British Expeditionary Force forced to retreat across the Channel at Dunkirk. The secret? The Panzers. They were not the biggest tanks nor the heaviest. In fact, many were lightly armored compared to Allied machines. But they were fast, disciplined, and part of something larger than themselves. The Panzer WWII, a training tank with thin armor and only machine guns, had been dismissed as unfit for real war. Yet in swarms it scouted, flanked, and harassed. The Panzer II, armed with a 20mm cannon, offered little more firepower but added speed and reconnaissance capability. The backbone of the blitzkrieg was the Panzer III, equipped with a 37mm gun, deadly against most tanks of the late 1930s. Its armor was modest, but its crew was well drilled. Its radios ensured tight coordination, and it was the perfect weapon for fast-moving engagements. Then came the Panzer IV, the heaviest of the early war fleet, boasting a short-barreled 75mm gun designed to blast infantry in bunkers. Together, these machines weren't just weapons, they were the moving parts of a doctrine. German strategy wasn't about brute strength. It was about movement, shock, precision. Tanks weren't meant to duel. They were meant to encircle, to bypass, to paralyze the enemy's will to fight. And it worked. For the crews, success bred confidence. They saw themselves as the spearhead of an unstoppable force. Victories in Poland, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France weren't just military triumphs. They were proof that the Wehrmacht was invincible. Inside those steel hulls, young men believed they were untouchable. With discipline drilled into them, radios linking every unit, and air power above clearing the skies, they felt as though they were riding the very future of war. Against such power, what chance could the Soviet Union possibly have? When German officers studied Soviet forces before Barbarossa, they saw a lumbering giant, poorly led, under-equipped, technologically backward. Stalin's purges had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, leaving chaos at the top. The Germans expected resistance, but nothing that could stand for long. For the Wehrmacht, the invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't a gamble. It was destiny. Soviet forces would collapse like dominoes, just as Poland had, just as France had. By Christmas of 1941, they expected to be marching through Moscow. The war machine thundered east, its engines roaring with arrogance, its soldiers convinced of triumph. But beneath the soil of the Soviet steppe lay a secret, a machine no intelligence report had warned them about, a tank that defied everything the Germans thought they knew about warfare. In the 1930s, while Europe basked in a fragile peace, the Soviet Union's engineers were quietly confronting a terrifying truth. The next war would be fought with machines, and tanks would decide it. The Soviet High Command had seen the devastation of World War I, where lumbering tanks first crawled across battlefields. They had studied German doctrine in Spain during the Civil War, where Panzer I tanks clashed with Soviet-supplied machines. And they had learned a harsh lesson. Speed and armor were no longer luxuries. They were survival. Enter Mikhail Koshkin, a man of vision. A designer who understood that the Red Army needed more than just another tank. Koshkin was not a soldier, but he thought like one. He imagined what a crew would face on the battlefield: mud, snow, swamps, and the relentless fire of enemy guns. His philosophy was simple, almost brutal. A tank must combine three elements in harmony: mobility, armor, and firepower. If one failed, the machine failed. By the mid-1930s, Soviet factories were producing the BT series of fast tanks, based on the American Christie suspension system. They were quick but lightly armored, cavalry on tracks. Koshkin took that foundation and pushed it further. He envisioned a tank that could move like a BT, hit like artillery, and withstand punishment from any direction. The result was revolutionary. First, sloped armor. Where most tanks carried thick but vertical plates, Koshkin angled the armor. The sloping did two things at once. It increased the effective thickness against incoming rounds and caused many shells to ricochet harmlessly. It gave the T-34 the ability to shrug off weapons that tore through German tanks. Second, wide tracks. Soviet terrain was unforgiving. Rivers, marshes, deep snow. Where narrow German tracks bogged down, the T-34's wide tread spread its weight and kept it moving, grinding through mud and winter alike. Third, a powerful gun. At its heart, the T-34 carried a 76.2mm cannon, a weapon capable of destroying enemy armor at ranges that German crews could only dream of. It was not a compromise gun. It was a tank killer. This combination, armor, mobility, and firepower, was unlike anything in Europe. But there was a problem. Joseph Stalin himself. The Soviet leader distrusted radical innovation. He wanted numbers, not experiments. When Koshkin presented his design, Stalin was skeptical. He saw risk. He saw expense. And in the Soviet Union of the late 1930s, skepticism from Stalin could mean the end of more than just a career. Koshkin persisted. He argued that the Red Army's survival depended on a tank like the T-34. To prove it, in the spring of 1940, he staged a daring gamble. He drove his prototypes from Kharkov to Moscow, over 1,000 kilometers through mud and snow, to show Stalin what the tank could endure. The gamble worked. Stalin was impressed, and he approved production. Factories roared to life in secret. The Soviet Union began producing the T-34, quietly, methodically, far from German eyes. No spy network uncovered the scale of this buildup. No intelligence officer reported the revolution taking place in Soviet steelworks. By June 1941, when German tanks rolled into the Soviet Union, thousands of T-34s were already in the field, hidden in forests, waiting. When German crews first encountered it, their reports sounded unreal. They described armor that deflected their shells, tracks that crossed terrain thought impassable, and guns that destroyed panzers from distances beyond reach. One German officer wrote, "This is not a tank from this world. It is a tank from the future." The T-34 had been born in secrecy, forged in fear, approved by a dictator, but perfected by engineers who understood that survival demanded innovation. And when it finally appeared, it did not just surprise the enemy, it terrified them. June 22, 1941. The greatest invasion in history had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers surged across an 1,800-mile front. Columns of panzers thundered east, their crews certain of victory. Operation Barbarossa, they believed, would be the climax of Blitzkrieg, one final crushing blow. For the first days, the pattern felt familiar. Soviet units were caught off guard, encircled, shattered. Entire divisions collapsed under the speed of German advances. The Wehrmacht pressed forward with confidence, their war machine performing like clockwork. But soon, the clock broke. Outside Minsk, Smolensk, and the vast fields of Ukraine, German tankers encountered something that defied expectation. As one panzer platoon advanced through the rolling countryside, they spotted silhouettes on the horizon, squat, angular machines with wide tracks. At first, they assumed they were facing the same outdated Soviet models they had already destroyed in droves. The gunner of a Panzer III lined up his shot. He fired. The shell slammed against the Soviet armor and bounced. The commander ordered another. Again, sparks flew, but the Soviet tank kept rolling. Panic rippled through the crew. They had seen shells fail before, but never like this. The Soviet machine advanced relentlessly, its 76mm gun swiveling toward them. Then came the thunder. A single blast. The panzer shuddered, erupted in flames. Survivors scrambled from the wreckage, their confidence consumed in fire and smoke. This was the T-34, and beside it lurked another monster, the KV-1. A heavy tank so impervious that German gunners reported watching their rounds ricochet like stones against an iron wall. One account described German shells bouncing off a KV-1 as if the tank were made of granite. At close range, panzer crews emptied their magazines in desperation, to no effect. Letters from the front carried the shock back to Germany. One soldier wrote, "We are facing a new kind of tank. Our weapons are useless against it. The shells simply slide off its armor. How are we to fight such a beast?" Another officer, reporting to Berlin, admitted grimly, "The Russian T-34 is superior to our Panzer III and IV. We require new weapons if we are to continue." For German crews who had grown accustomed to domination, the experience was shattering. In the span of a single battle, the myth of invincibility, the aura of Blitzkrieg, evaporated. The psychological toll was immense. Tankers who had once ridden into battle with pride now approached every engagement with dread. The sight of a T-34 rolling across the fields brought a chill that steel could not stop. Field Marshal von Kleist, commanding Panzer Group 1, famously reported, "The T-34 is the finest tank in the world." And yet, it wasn't just admiration, it was fear. German officers understood that their army had underestimated the Soviet Union completely. The shock spread all the way to the top. Reports to Berlin carried an undertone of disbelief. The Soviets, who were supposed to collapse in weeks, had unveiled a weapon the Wehrmacht could not counter. The front line became a nightmare of improvisation. German crews aimed for weak spots, tracks, rear armor, vision slits, praying for a lucky strike. Infantry scrambled with grenades and makeshift charges, throwing themselves against steel giants in acts of desperation. But for every Soviet tank destroyed, more seemed to emerge from the forests and fields, their engines roaring like beasts awakened from slumber. In the summer of 1941, the hunter became the hunted. The summer of 1941 should have been a triumph. Instead, it became a reckoning. German panzer crews had rolled into the Soviet Union expecting another lightning victory. What they encountered instead was the T-34, a machine that deflected their shells, tore through their armor, and shattered their confidence. Desperation forced adaptation. When standard tank guns failed, commanders turned to an unlikely savior, the 80mm flak gun. Originally designed to shoot enemy aircraft out of the skies, its sheer power was unmatched. Hastily lowered against Soviet armor, the weapon proved devastating. At last, German gunners could punch through the T-34's sloped plates and even the monstrous KV-1. But there was a problem. Setting up an 88mm meant halting an advance. Exposing crews and relying on a weapon never meant for frontline duels. The Luftwaffe became another lifeline. Dive bombers, the infamous Stuka, were called upon to hunt Soviet armor from the skies. Screaming down from above, they struck T-34s with bombs and cannons, giving the panzer divisions a chance to breathe. But Soviet skies were vast, weather unpredictable, and the Red Army's tanks seemed to multiply faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. On the ground, tactics shifted from confidence to caution. Panzer commanders no longer charged head-on. Instead, they relied on flanking maneuvers, trying to encircle Soviet machines and attack their weaker side or rear. Crews coordinated massed fire, concentrating multiple tanks on a single T-34, hoping that volume, not caliber, would finally bring one down. Infantry were trained to swarm enemy tanks with explosives, a desperate dance of men against machines. Still, these adaptations carried a bitter taste. For the first time in the war, German tankers realized they were fighting from behind. They weren't dictating the battlefield anymore, they were surviving it. Back in Berlin, propaganda offices scrambled. Films and radio broadcasts continued to trumpet the myth of German superiority, downplaying the Soviet tractor tanks. Official reports carefully avoided admitting just how deadly the T-34 truly was. Yet at the front, every soldier knew the truth. In private letters, despair leaked through the censor's cracks. One panzer commander confessed, "Our panzers are children against these new Russian tanks. Only the 88 can stop them. Without it, we are powerless." For the crews who had once carried themselves with pride, the shift was crushing. They had been the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, the hunters of Europe. Now they found themselves on the defensive, improvising with weapons never meant for tank warfare, facing an enemy they hadn't been trained to fight. Even victories felt hollow. Every destroyed T-34 was replaced by two more. Every Soviet machine knocked out revealed a deeper, darker reality. The Red Army had the numbers, the terrain, and now, the technology. The T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was a message, a signal that the war in the East would not be quick. It would not be easy. And for the first time, German crews began to wonder if it could even be won. If the battlefield shocked the Germans, the factory floors would terrify them even more. In the summer of 1941, as German armies surged deeper into Soviet territory, the Kremlin made a decision of staggering audacity: move entire industries eastward, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe and advancing panzers. What followed was one of the greatest industrial migrations in history. Machinery was dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and carried thousands of miles to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Workers, men, women, even children, followed the machines. They rebuilt entire factories and open fields, often before walls or roofs were even erected. Production began under canvas tents, beneath snow, beside furnaces without insulation. Conditions were brutal. Food was scarce. Workers slept beside their machines, sometimes collapsing on factory floors from exhaustion. And yet, the tanks rolled out. By late 1942, the Soviet Union was producing T-34s at a rate the Germans could scarcely imagine. Dozens a day, thousands a month. The tanks were not polished. Finishing was crude. Welds were rough and paint often rushed. But they worked, and they killed. German crews began to notice the difference. Where one T-34 was destroyed, another soon appeared. Where a battalion of Soviet tanks had been crushed, two more took its place. For every panzer victory, there seemed to be another wave of steel advancing across the steppe. The Wehrmacht, for all its efficiency, could not keep pace. German factories, though advanced, were fewer and more vulnerable. Their tanks were meticulously crafted, precise, engineered to perfection, but slow to produce. The Soviet Union embraced a brutal equation. Quantity was its own form of quality. One German officer captured the dread in his report. "We knock out a Russian tank, and two more appear in its place. It is as if their factories run on endless fuel, while ours crawl to keep up." By 1943, the truth was undeniable. Germany was not only outmatched on the battlefield, it was being outproduced in the factory. The Soviet industrial machine had awakened, and it was relentless by 1943. The Eastern Front had transformed into a war of titans. The Germans, reeling from catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, understood that their panzer divisions could no longer rely on improvisation alone. They needed new machines, bigger, stronger, deadlier. The answer came in the form of the Tiger and the Panther, armored giants bristling with high-velocity cannons and thick plating that seemed impervious to earlier Soviet fire. For a moment, it seemed as though German armor had clawed back dominance. Tiger tanks could destroy T-34s at ranges where the Soviet guns barely scratched their paint. To German crews, the Tiger was salvation, a chance to restore the aura of invincibility that had been shattered 2 years earlier. But the Soviets had no intention of falling behind. In the shadow of their relocated factories, Soviet engineers were already preparing a new answer, the T-34-85. This upgraded version, rolling out in 1943, carried a powerful 85mm gun, capable of piercing the thick armor of Tigers and Panthers. Its frontal armor was reinforced, yet it still maintained the mobility that had made the original T-34 so revolutionary. The battlefield was entering a new era of escalation. Every German innovation forced a Soviet response and vice versa. The result was an arms race fought not in laboratories alone, but in blood and steel across the plains of Ukraine, the forests of Belarus, and the ruins of countless villages. Yet for all the German technological marvels, there was a fundamental imbalance: numbers. The Wehrmacht could field Tigers and Panthers, but only in hundreds. The Soviets, with their relentless industrial drive, could field T-34-85s in the tens of thousands. For every Tiger that thundered forward, there were 5 or 10 T-34s waiting, engines growling, crews hardened by years of brutal war. German tank aces described the terrifying reality. Yes, a Tiger could knock out a T-34 at a mile's distance, but when 3 more appeared from the tree line, and 5 more from behind a hill, even the most elite crews found themselves overwhelmed. It wasn't just a duel of machines, it was a duel of strategies. Quality against quantity, innovation against endurance. And in that duel, the T-34 remained the backbone of Soviet offensives. Whether storming across open steppes or rumbling through the streets of recaptured cities, the upgraded T-34-85 symbolized not only Soviet resilience, but Soviet momentum. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer on the defensive. It was advancing, pushing the Wehrmacht westward step by bloody step. And wherever the front shifted, one sound became unmistakable: the grinding tracks of T-34s rolling forward in waves. The tank that had once shocked German crews in 1941 was now their constant tormentor, improved, multiplied, and unstoppable. July 5, 1943, Kursk, Soviet Union. The largest tank battle in history was about to unfold. Over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns lined up across the sun-scorched steppes. German hopes for a decisive victory, the one that might restore their shattered aura of invincibility, rested on the shoulders of the Tiger and Panther. These machines were engineering marvels, bristling with firepower and thick armor, symbols of a Wehrmacht still desperate to dominate the battlefield. But waiting for them was a wall of steel and determination. Soviet defenses layered in depth, with T-34s forming the very core of the anti-German barricades. Mines, trenches, anti-tank guns, and artillery created a killing ground where the attackers would meet their first true test. The battle began with thunder. German tanks surged forward, engines growling, tracks tearing the earth beneath them. Tigers and Panthers engaged T-34s at long range, scoring kills that would have been impossible only months earlier. For a moment, it seemed that the myth of German superiority might be restored. Yet the T-34s were relentless. They emerged from forests, villages, and behind ridges, their crews disciplined and prepared. When shells failed against their sloped armor, they struck back with 76mm and upgraded 85-pounder guns, often in massed volleys. Entire battalions of German tanks found themselves trapped in kill zones, unable to advance without suffering heavy losses. The terrain itself became part of the battle. Fields that once promised swift German maneuvers were now riddled with craters, burning wrecks, and hidden Soviet artillery. Columns of tanks ground to a halt, exposed to flanking fire. Smoke, fire, and the cries of soldiers filled the air. For the first time on such a massive scale, the Wehrmacht realized the limits of blitzkrieg. Speed and precision could not compensate for the immovable wave of Soviet steel. German officers wrote home with a mixture of awe and despair. The Russians are everywhere. Their tanks are not only fast but seemingly endless. We hit one and another appears. This is not the same war we fought in France. By mid-July, the tide had shifted. German offensives stalled. Tigers and Panthers, formidable as they were, could not break the Soviet lines. Losses mounted and reserves dwindled. The T-34s, though individually less powerful, had worn down the elite German armor, attrition tipping the scale irreversibly. Kursk became more than a battle. It was a revelation. The T-34, once underestimated, had proven itself against the pinnacle of German engineering. The tank that had shattered the Wehrmacht's confidence in 1941 was now instrumental in ensuring Soviet dominance on the Eastern Front. For the German High Command, the lesson was bitter and clear. The offensive advantage had shifted permanently. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had conquered Europe, had met its match. The T-34 had not just survived the clash, it had defined it, rewriting the rules of armored warfare. The T-34 was more than steel and firepower. It was a shadow that haunted German tank crews across the Eastern Front. By 1943 and 1944, panzer crews faced an enemy that had proven to be relentless, numerous, and shockingly effective. Letters smuggled back home told a grim story: exhaustion that never ended, fear that lingered long after the battle, and a growing disillusionment with the promises of victory that had carried them into war. One young officer wrote from the front, "We are trained, we are skilled, but every time we face them, it feels like the ground itself rises against us. We hit one T-34 and 5 more appear. We know our guns may not be enough and we pray for luck that rarely comes." The psychological strain was immense. Crews who had once ridden with confidence now approached every encounter with dread. Even when leading an attack, the knowledge of facing a T-34's sloped armor and powerful gun loomed over every decision. Mistakes became lethal, hesitation was fatal, and the sense of invincibility, that hallmark of Blitzkrieg, had evaporated. Skepticism toward the high command grew. Hitler's promises of superweapons that would turn the tide seemed increasingly hollow. Tigers and Panthers feared by Soviet crews were often too few, too slow, or too exposed to make a decisive impact. The contrast was stark. The Soviets had numbers, resilience, and an industrial machine capable of replacing losses far faster than the Germans could replace theirs. For many German soldiers, the T-34 became a symbol, not just of a tank, but of the endless, unforgiving resilience of the Soviet Union. It was a machine that seemed to appear everywhere, unstoppable, embodying both a technological and psychological edge. Every T-34 destroyed was quickly replaced. Every ambush, every defensive line seemed preordained. Diaries reveal the despair. One Panzer crewman noted, "We fight, but the enemy's strength never ends. Their tanks are steel ghosts, their numbers endless. Even when we win, it feels hollow, like shouting into a void." The T-34 had achieved something rare in war. It broke more than tanks. It broke confidence, hope, and certainty. Its battlefield record was devastating, but its psychological impact was just as profound. Where German crews had once believed they could dictate the tempo of war, they now found themselves reacting, retreating, improvising, and enduring. It was in the minds of these men, exhausted and terrified, that the legend of the T-34 was forged, a symbol of Soviet ingenuity, of unyielding production, and of a nation that refused to be crushed. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the T-34 was no longer just a weapon of war, it had become a legend. Its tracks had carved paths across Europe and the Soviet Union, leaving behind not only destroyed panzers but shattered illusions. Across the world, the T-34 came to symbolize resilience, innovation, and the indomitable spirit of a nation that refused to yield. In the decades following the war, T-34s served in scores of countries, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and beyond. They were a staple of post-war armies, a reminder that simple, effective design and relentless production could rival even the most sophisticated machines. Militaries studied the T-34 carefully, adapting its lessons into new doctrines of armored warfare. Sloped armor, mobility over weight, massed production, and psychological impact on both enemy and crew. Yet the true legacy of the T-34 lies not just in blueprints or strategy books. It lies in the minds it altered. German tank crews, once confident in their invincibility, had learned a bitter truth. No technology, no matter how precise, could dominate when faced with innovation, determination, and sheer perseverance. The T-34 became more than steel. It became a symbol of what happens when human ingenuity and resilience converge under pressure. Historians and veterans alike reflect on its impact. The tank did not merely crush offensives, it crushed illusions. It reminded the world that war is not won by arrogance or assumption, but by preparation, adaptability, and relentless resolve. In every creaking turret, in every grinding track, in every clash with enemy fire, the T-34 told a story of survival and determination that transcended borders and generations. Even today, in museums, memorials, and in the memories of those who studied it, the T-34 remains an enduring testament, a machine that changed not just the battles of the Eastern Front, but the very way nations understood armored warfare. It is a reminder that innovation, courage, and tenacity often outweigh brute strength or fleeting confidence.